Ever get the feeling that, like, just reading the law, it's like trying to crack some kind of secret code?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what we're diving into today, right? We're going deep into this whole world of legal interpretation.
Yeah.
And to help us make sense of it all, we've got Justice Stephen Breyer's book, NUW, Reading the Constitution.
Look.
So we're really trying to figure out, like, what's going on beneath the surface of all those words,
It's a trip, right? This whole dance between, like, what the law actually says versus what somebody somewhere meant for it to do.
Yeah.
Because, let's be honest, those two things, not always on the same page.
It's kind of like when you're, I don't know, trying a new recipe and it says something vague like add a pinch of salt, but you never bother to ask your grandma what she really meant by that.
Oh, we've been there.
Right. Like, too little and the whole thing's a wash, too much and you've just ruined dinner.
Exactly. And in law, it's not just dinner on the line, right? The stakes are way, way higher.
Oh, absolutely.
And Breyer uses this, like, really clever thought experiment to kind of drive that home,
Yeah.
It's like, imagine a train ticket. Plain and simple, it says no animals allowed. Seems straightforward, yeah. But then he throws a curveball. What about a snail?
Okay, yeah, that's a tough one. Technically, right, a snail is an animal, but it's not like it's going to cause a ruckus on the train or anything.
Right.
So how do you even begin to, like, untangle that and figure out what that rule means in that case?
And that is the million-dollar question when it comes to this whole legal interpretation game. Do you just go with the strict dictionary definition of animal? Or do you take a step back and think, okay, what's the bigger picture here? What's the purpose behind this rule? Which, in this case, is probably to prevent, a whole zoo from ending up on the train.
Right, like a herd of elephants.
Exactly. Disruptive creatures.
Okay, so, like, context is everything.
100%. Breyer's totally against this whole idea of taking the law literally. And he even brings in the philosopher Montaigne to back him up.
Okay, gotta be honest, I haven't exactly brushed up on my Montaigne lately.
Well, he basically, like, warns us about trying to shove the beautiful messiness of, human experience into these neat little boxes of legal language. And he was saying this, centuries ago? But it's still so relevant today to how we make sense of the law.
So it's like trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. You can try, but something's going to get messed up along the way.
Exactly. And that's why Breyer says it's so crucial to get the historical and societal context right. Like, why was this law created in the first place? What problem was it trying to solve? What was happening in the world when these words were first written down?
It's not just about the words themselves then, it's about the world those words were, like, born into.
Exactly. And sometimes, honestly, understanding that context completely changes how we understand what a law is actually trying to tell us.
So if figuring out what a law means isn't as easy as just, like, reading the words on the page, what are the actual tools that judges use? I mean, how did they cut through all the legalese and get to the heart of the matter?
Well, it's not quite as simple as busting out a magnifying glass and putting on a deerstalker hat.
Right.
But Breyer does give us a glimpse into, like, what he calls the toolbox of legal interpretation,
Okay, so what's in this toolbox? Give me the rundown.
Well, he talks about, the actual text itself, obviously, but it's way more than that. He talks about the historical context, like we were saying, traditions, any relevant rulings that came before, the law's whole purpose, like, what were they even trying to do with this thing? And even, get this, the potential consequences of different ways of reading it.
Wow, okay, so it's not just about splitting hairs over commas and whatnot. There are a lot of moving parts here.
Oh, yeah.
Does he have any, like, real-world examples where looking beyond the literal words, actually changed the game, like how a case was decided?
Oh, totally. A great one is this thing called the Chevron deference principle.
Okay, that sounds kind of intimidating.
It sounds way fancier than it is. It's actually pretty common sense. Basically, it says that when you've got a law that's, like, super specific to a certain field, like, say, environmental stuff, the courts should generally defer to the experts, the agency that actually deals with that stuff day in and day out.
So, like, if the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, if they interpret some part of the Clean Water Act a certain way, the courts should give that interpretation a lot of weight.
Exactly. And the Clean Water Act is actually a perfect example of how zooming out, considering the purpose behind the whole thing, it can totally change how you understand the little details.
How so?
Well, the act is all about protecting water, keeping it clean.
Right.
So you run into these terms like navigable waters, which on the surface seems pretty cut and dry, right? You can sail a boat on it, it's navigable, end of story.
Seems straightforward enough.
Right. But when you think about the purpose clean waters suddenly, it clicks that it's not just about where you can take a boat, it's about the whole ecosystem, right? Protecting a wetland, even if you can't like go water skiing on it, is super important for the health of all the waterways connected to it. It's all connected.
Right. It's like one loose thread can unravel a whole sweater. You got to see that one thread as part of a bigger picture.
Perfect analogy. And that's a big part of why Breyer's a little skeptical, I think, of this super strict textualist approach, like where you're laser focused on the literal words, especially when you're dealing with these big kind of abstract ideas in the Constitution, things like legislative power or executive power, you know.
So you're saying trying to nail down those concepts, which are kind of huge and open-ended, trying to like trap them in a dictionary definition, you might miss the point entirely.
Exactly. These ideas, they need a little breathing room, right? They need to be able to flex and adapt as the world changes around them. I mean, think about it. Different eras in American history, they've had wildly different interpretations of the exact same words in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Like, take the Lochner era, for example, back in the early 1900s.
Okay, the Lochner era. Refresh my memory on that one.
Okay, so back then, the Supreme Court was super hands-off when it came to economic regulation. They were all about this idea of freedom of contract, even if it meant, like, workers were getting a raw deal. They were basically taking liberties super literally without really thinking about the bigger picture, the human cost.
So it was all about individual freedom, even if it meant some people got left behind.
Exactly. But then, boom, the Great Depression hits. And suddenly this idea of the government, actually stepping in to do something about the economy to protect workers, that starts to make a lot more sense to people, So you get the New Deal era, where the Supreme Court's like, okay, maybe these words do give the government some power to tackle these big social and economic problems.
So it's not that the words themselves changed, but the way they were understood, it evolved as society changed.
You got it. And that's like a huge takeaway for understanding how any of this works, this whole legal interpretation game. It's not like some fixed one-size-fits-all thing. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
Right? This back and forth between the text, the context, and, the times we're living in.
So we've been talking about how the way we understand laws can kind of shift and evolve over time. But what about this idea of legal precedent? Like, shouldn't courts generally stick with what's been decided before? How does that fit into everything we've been talking about?
You're talking about stare decisis. It's Latin, of course, for to stand by things decided.
Of course.
Like one of the cornerstones of our whole legal system, right?
Yeah.
Because it keeps things kind of stable, predictable. Can you imagine if, like, every time a new case popped up, the courts could just completely ignore all the decisions that came before it?
Oh, man. Yeah. Talk about a roller coaster.
It'd be total chaos, right?
Yeah, the legal system would be stuck in this endless loop of, like, changing its mind every 5 seconds.
Exactly. But here's the thing, stare decisis, it's not about, like, blindly following outdated rulings, right? It's more nuanced than that.
So it's not like a straitjacket, it's more like, I don't know, guardrails, maybe? Like, it provides some boundaries, but you've got some wiggle room within those boundaries.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Breyer really gets into this whole tension, right, between scare decisis, this idea that we should generally stick to precedent, and, the need for the law to be able to, like, grow and change with the times.
Yeah.
Especially when he talks about the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the one that overturned Roe v. Wade.
Right, yeah. That was huge. Definitely sparked a lot of debate about exactly this, the whole role of precedent. So what's Breyer's take?
Well, he's pretty clear that he sees the Dobbs decision as like a major departure from stare decisis, And he suggests that when courts start overturning these really well-established precedents based solely on one judge's, particular interpretation, especially if it's a really strict literal interpretation, it could have some pretty big consequences, not just for that one case, but for the whole system.
So it's not just about abortion then, it's about the integrity of the whole legal system.
Exactly. Like, when courts are like, okay, we're tossing out decades of precedent because we're reading the Constitution this very specific way.
Right.
It makes people wonder, like, wait, so what are the rules here? Can they just change whenever?
Right, yeah, it starts to feel kind of arbitrary, like the rug could be pulled out from under you at any moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that erosion of trust, that's a big deal.
Absolutely. So, okay, big picture time. What does all of this mean for, the average person, for those of us who aren't lawyers but are just trying to make sense of this whole thing?
I think it means that now more than ever, really understanding how this all works, this whole process of legal interpretation, it's not just some abstract academic exercise, right? It's about recognizing that the law is a living, breathing thing.
It's not just like set in stone.
Right, exactly. It's always evolving, being interpreted, reinterpreted, applied to new situations all the time.
Yeah, it's like the map is not the territory, right? You need the map, you need to know the landmarks, but you also got to be ready for detours, The landscape changes.
I love that analogy, and that's what makes these conversations so important, right? Because when we understand the tools, the approaches that judges are using, we're all better equipped to be part of the conversation about, like, where our legal system goes from here.
Absolutely. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of legal interpretation with Justice Stephen Breyer. Big takeaway.
Big takeaway.
Don't just take the law at face value, right? Ask questions, keep an open mind, and remember, it's a living thing, this law stuff, not just some dusty old book on a shelf.
Couldn't said it better myself. And hey, if you're listening out there, remember, you're part of this conversation too. How the law gets interpreted, it affects all of us. So stay curious, keep asking those questions.